So let's talk about how the Mexican government actually implemented the reforms of the 1917 Constitution after the revolution was finally over and done with. A new political party arises. It was originally called the PRN, but it's more commonly known by its newer name, the PRI, which stands for the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution. And this was first created by its original president, Calles, who served from 1924 to 1928, and it was meant to create stability to Mexican politics. So when Calles was elected in 1924, it was the first populist presidential election in Mexico's history. And the reason why it became so popular was because it embraced some of the slogans and images from the revolution. So some of the ideals that the more leftist revolutionaries embraced, like land redistribution and reform, which ultimately were not materialized when Carranza was president, are going to be some of the major symbols of the 1924 election, which is one of the reasons why Calles was so popular. He's going to be succeeded by Lazaro Cardenas, and when Cardenas is president, the PRI party membership expanded to all, and it remains the majority party for over 50 years. And when Cardenas was president, he called for a 6-year plan of social and political reform, which was modeled after the Soviet Union's. And so, under this plan, he wanted to destroy the hacienda economy, right, the large scale farms, and create or recreate rather a more collective system of ejidos, the commonly held lands. He also pushed back against the Catholic Church. Remember, that was also a provision of the Constitution of 1917, because he continued to work towards establishing modern secular schools and also to teach more science and eradicate the influence of the Catholic Church. And also, he called for workers' cooperatives to oppose some of the excesses of industrial capitalism. So you can see that when Cardenas is president, he starts to actually push back against foreign influence over the economy. And one of the other reasons why this is because when Cardenas is president, the Great Depression begins. And so the United States actually cannot rely as heavily on the foreign on foreign sales, right? They are ultimately prevented from importing many goods because the production in areas like the United States is going to decline significantly when the Great Depression sets in. Other questions about how Mexico's economy changes when Lazaro Cardenas is president? Well, like we said, Mexico can no longer rely on imports due to the decline in foreign production. So this is when Mexico incorporates ISI, or Import Substitution Industrialization, which, as we know, it diversifies and protects new domestic industries. Lazaro Cardenas also seizes foreign property in order to nationalize the oil industry. As you remember, this was one of the provisions of the Constitution of 1917, and it finally materializes here. And Cardenas expropriates equipment of foreign oil companies in Mexico and ultimately takes over the Mexican control of the oil industry. And Cardenas also institutes land reforms. We already discussed that, actually, breaking up the haciendas. But there will be another shift in the Mexican economy because, of course, as we know, the U.S. pulls itself out of the Depression once World War II begins. And so the stability in Mexico politically is going to actually bring about an increase in foreign investment in Mexico during World War II. So because it remains stable under the leadership of the PRI, this is going to lead to the increase in foreign investment yet again after the war. So that decrease in foreign investment is only temporary, of course, brought on by the onset of the Great Depression. The Bracero program will bring about some pretty dramatic changes in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. So the Bracero program lasted from 1942 to 1964. It was initially a World War II era program to try to fill the U.S. demand for labor, but it continues onward after that because of pressure from U.S. industries, particularly agribusiness. Bracero is Spanish for manual labor, and the number of workers involved in the program throughout the years were between 4.5 and 5 million. And the peak year of the Bracero program, which shows you that it's clearly not just a World War II era program, was 1956, when almost 500,000 Braceros were employed under the program in that year alone. The reason for the initial demand in labor was because traditional farm workers, so American born, left because they were serving for the military. There was a large draft in World War II. And also, many of them sought out, if they did not serve military duty, they sought out higher paying jobs in war related industries. So the U.S. government looked for other sources of unskilled labor, and they looked south to Mexico. Remember again that some of the immigration legislation that we talked about previously discouraged immigrants from other countries such as Asia and also Eastern Europe. So laborers under the Bracero program were so-called guaranteed certain things, which would encourage them to enter into the program. They were guaranteed transportation to the Bracero, their living expenses were paid, their lodging, medical care, and also repatriation once the program was finished. And they were also guaranteed wages, quote, the same as those paid for similar work to other agricultural laborers under the same conditions within the same area, end quote. But these working conditions were largely subpar, as we'll see through some images in just a moment. Why did the Bracero program continue into the Cold War? Well, a lot of it continued under the guise of the U.S. State Department. When the Cold War was beginning, the State Department was actually also increasingly worried that Mexico would come under communist influence, so the Bracero program was seen as a way to promote harmony between the two countries and also to improve the financial condition of Mexicans. They thought if there was more of a source of labor for Mexicans, they might not be as willing to resort to communism. Who might oppose the Bracero program, and why would they do that? First off, there were domestic workers and anti-immigration forces that rallied against the Braceros. And also, there were migrant workers within sometimes the Mexican community that founded large-scale movements to oppose the U.S. program because they argued that it was exploitative, which it indeed was. So historically, the Chicanos' political position on the importation of foreign guest workers was adamant opposition. There were also labor unions, so there was sort of a nativist movement against the Bracero program because they believed that it was a key impediment to improving the conditions of the wages of domestic workers. So after the war ended, there was a concern that the Braceros could be used to replace U.S. citizens as workers, especially if workers wanted to unionize or go on strike. And from the beginning, the program had brought in a relatively small number of workers, but because there were more workers who wanted to come into the U.S., and then there were actual jobs. This led to a massive increase in illegal migration. Many people came across the border looking for work who were not officially part of the program. And because there were farmers who wanted to hire these braceros, they weren't actually braceros, but people that came in because of the promises of the Bracero program, they could also be hired illegally because they were willing to accept lower pay. And so there were actual legitimacies behind the opposition to the Bracero program. Because the labor was not paid as well, it did sometimes replace more domestic sources of labor. Operation Wetback was another major result of the Bracero program, which shows us increasing tensions surrounding Mexican migration into the United States. So as we were saying earlier, the Bracero program, although it was intended just to be a wartime arrangement, it kept going because of pressure from U.S. growers. They were still afraid of the labor shortage because there was a booming economy after World War II. So a number of veterans actually pursued better employment, higher paying jobs, and also education that they gained as a result of the GI Bill. And so the numbers of braceros actually still fall short of the demand, and growers try to also recruit undocumented workers. So this falls beyond the scope of the Bracero program. There's also a public pressure to respond to the increased number of Mexican immigrants and also just immigrants in general in the United States. After the Korean War ends, there's, in general, a more restrictionist public sentiment towards migration, and so the U.S. government responds to these pressures with Operation Wetback, which was a general effort to try to deport illegal immigrants in the United States. So you can see that Operation Wetback and the lingering pressures from industry to keep these migrant workers in the United States is going to cause a lot of tension and confusion in this period for Mexican workers. The Operation Wetback program in 1954 alone apprehended close to 1 million illegal workers. It was primarily a response to pressure from a broad coalition of farmers that were concerned with the effects of Mexican immigrants living in the U.S. without legal permission. And after it was implemented, Operation Wetback gave rise to arrests and deportation by U.S. Border Patrol, and these resulted in a number of civil rights violations. They also resulted in several hundred U.S. citizens who were illegally deported without given a chance to prove their citizenship. So, as we know, there were a number of Mexican Americans who were citizens in this region, and there was little distinction by the U.S. government between these two. There were overall over 1 million returns, defined as confirmed movement of an inadmissible or deportable alien out of the U.S., not based on an order of removal, just in the first year of Operation Wetback. And the program resulted overall in a more permanent and strategic Border Patrol presence along the U.S.-Mexico border. Some of the consequences to the program. First off, the name wetback was a disparaging term that was applied to illegal immigrants who were supposedly entering the United States by swimming across the Rio Grande. And so you can see just the name itself gives us a sense of the U.S. government's stance towards Mexican migrants. And one of the biggest problems that was caused by the program for the deportees was that when they were deported, they were sent to unfamiliar parts of Mexico, and from there they had to struggle to find their way home, or also to continue to support their families. More than 25% of apprehended Mexicans were returned specifically to the port of Veracruz on cargo ships, and others were transported by land to southern cities in Mexico. Many of the people who were deported did not receive the opportunity to recover their property in the U.S. or to contact their families, and so they were stranded without any food or employment when they were released in Mexico. And deported Mexicans sometimes faced very extreme weather conditions in their country. 88 deported workers in 1955 died in the 112-degree Fahrenheit heat when they were more or less left stranded when they crossed the Mexican border on their way home. And then, of course, meanwhile, to appease the growers, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, also called the INS, repossessed a lot of the undocumented Mexicans who were deported by Operation Wetback and then just returned them straight to the fields as legal braceros. So during the entirety of Operation Wetback, the border recruitment of illegal workers by American growers continued, and this was due largely to the low cost of illegal labor and the desires of growers to avoid the bureaucratic obstacles of the Bracero program. So again, they continue to turn towards illegal immigration despite U.S. law and despite continued public pressure to do something about this illegal immigration across the border. And so again, there was a continuation of illegal immigration despite the efforts of Operation Wetback, and that was largely the reason why Operation Wetback failed. And at the same time that immigration enforcement was expanding in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Bracero program was also rapidly expanding legal opportunities for Mexican laborers. And although the Bracero program began as a wartime measure, again, it saw its largest expansion after the war. The number of wartime Braceros peaked at 62,000 in 1944, but the number again began to rise in the late 1940s and reached its peak in 1956 when the program gave temporary work permits to 445,000 Mexican workers. So again, you can see sort of this tension between the public and also the U.S. government to limit migration, but also the private sector, largely people who have economic interests in continuing to have a source of cheap labor to keep this program going, either legally through the Braceros or also just to sort of ignore any immigration enforcement by more or less not patrolling border crossings.